Welcome to Cozy Love Stories, your home for wholesome, dreamy romances to help you relax and unwind. Juliet Isaacs never expected her quiet poems to reach beyond the door of her seaside cottage, where fear has kept her hidden from the world. Adrian Blake never expected a submission to stir him so deeply, or for a mysterious poet's words to linger long after he read them. What begins as an exchange of letters slowly grows into something more, an unexpected bond that could lead to love if Juliet can only find the courage to step out of the shadows. So settle in, let the world slow down, and enjoy today's story, Love, Postmarked. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick disclaimer that one of the main characters of this story does struggle with anxiety and panic attacks. So if that's something that can be triggering for you, I have some other stories that I think you'd really enjoy that don't feature those topics, and you can check them out on the channel. Chapter 1. The morning had begun in stillness. Juliet woke as the last shadows of night faded into the cool blue of pre-dawn. By the time she dressed, the sun was lifting over the horizon, brushing the sky in shades of rose and gold. She poured mint tea into a thermos, walked the short path to the beach, and settled onto the damp edge of the shore. Her journal lay open across her knees, the steady rush of waves the only sound beyond the scratch of pen on paper. As she wrote, the light shifted, pink to pale yellow, yellow to clear blue. She paused to watch the water glint beneath the sun. Juliet loved these quiet hours when the day felt like hers alone. A sudden bark broke through the calm as a dog bounded toward the surf with a couple strolling behind it. The woman glanced up, caught Juliet's eye, and offered a friendly smile. Juliet's heart lurched. She snapped her journal shut and rose in one swift motion, pulse kicking. She bolted up the narrow path that led from the beach, through spindly trees and tufts of grass rooted in the sandy soil, until the familiar sight of her great-aunt's cottage appeared ahead. She climbed the back steps 2 at a time, flung open the door, and shut it hard behind her. Leaning against it, she pressed a hand to her chest and willed herself to breathe. Safe again. She was safe again, Juliet reminded herself as she choked air into her lungs. Inside these walls, she could control the world. When her pulse finally slowed, she walked to her quiet kitchen for a glass of water. On the table sat a flyer she'd found in yesterday's mail. She must have read through it 50 times since it arrived. Shaking her head, Juliet crumpled the flyer, but she found she couldn't toss it in the trash. The offending wad of paper still lay on the table as she moved on to her daily routine. 40 minutes of yoga, 1 smoothie, and 2 chapters of her book later, the flyer still weighed on her mind. She returned to the kitchen, smoothed the crumpled paper, and read it again. Harbor Light's literary journal, Resident Poet Wanted. The local magazine was offering a $25 honorarium for 1 poem a month. She didn't need the money, not really. Her aunt's inheritance would last her years if she lived carefully, but she couldn't shake the conviction that she needed to apply. Juliet spied the journal she'd flung on the table after her harried return from the beach that morning. She flipped it open, her words staring up at her. I keep the windows ajar for the wind, though it carries no voices, I know. Somewhere, unfinished hopes wait, like letters I forgot to send. Perhaps her words had a place beyond these walls, she thought to herself. Before she could talk herself out of it, Juliet copied the poem onto fresh paper and signed it simply J. Isaacs. She added a few more representative poems in a short note, then slid them into an envelope and sealed it. The cottage was mercifully tucked at the end of a curving lane, partially hidden from the main road by overgrown trees. After a peek through the window confirmed no one was outside, she dashed out to the old green mailbox at the end of the lane and slipped the envelope inside. For a moment, she kept her hand on the cold metal until the sound of a distant car sent her scurrying back to the cottage. Chapter 2. The office of Harbor Light's literary journal smelled faintly of ink and paper. Stacks of submissions leaned in precarious towers across Adrian Blake's desk. The low hum of the old printing press thrummed through the floorboards. "Another batch for you," called Gus, one of the junior editors, as he dropped a manila envelope on his desk. "Thanks," Adrian said, flipping it open. Inside, he found a few pages in neat handwriting. The return address listed a house on a quiet street he recognized from his walks through town. The signature simply showed J. Isaacs. He read through the first poem once, then again. It felt raw, alive with a yearning he could almost taste. "Something good?" Gus asked, leaning against the doorway. "Better than good," he said, not looking up. "It's evocative, honest. This is exactly the kind of voice we've been hoping for." "Careful, boss. You sound smitten. Probably just some retired fisherman with a thesaurus," Gus joked. Adrian grinned. "Well, if it is, I hope he's got a dozen more where this came from." Gus chuckled and left Adrian to read the remaining poems tucked into the envelope, each better than the last. He pulled works written by other resident poet contenders from a stack he'd marked earlier in the week. One by one, he read them aloud, then returned to J. Isaacs' pages. The difference was clear. The other poems were polished, but J's felt lived in, like they'd been pulled straight from a vein. It's the best we've got, he thought, but he couldn't send an offer yet. The submission window didn't close for another 2 days. He'd wait. Adrian leaned back, eyes drifting to the framed photo on the far wall. His father, Quentin Blake, at the very first press run of Harbor Lights. Fresh out of college, Quentin had built the nonprofit magazine from nothing in the coastal town of Windermere, Maine. It was the only magazine of its kind serving the area, featuring only local writers who lived in the state, especially those from Windermere itself. Over the years, it had even helped launch the careers of several full-time authors. By late afternoon, the last articles were proofed, and the hum of the press quieted for the day. Adrian shrugged on his coat, making a point to stop at every desk on his way out, trading a joke with Gus, complimenting the layout team, and pausing by the janitor, Frank, to ask how his granddaughter's piano recital went. Outside, the crisp bite of fall air met him. The harbor was already deepening into the bronze light of early evening. He walked the few blocks back to his apartment, swapping his button-down and slacks for a worn flannel and jeans. 10 minutes later, he was driving to the harbor to meet his father at the pier. Quentin was already there, leaning on the rail with 2 fishing rods at his side. "Thought you'd bailed on me," Quentin said with a grin. "Wouldn't miss it," Adrian replied, taking a rod. "So," Quentin said, baiting his line, "how's the magazine doing this week? Circulation holding? Any big pieces come in?" Adrian filled him in on circulation numbers and the upcoming anniversary issue, before adding, "We got a contender for the resident poet spot. Could be one of the best we've had in years." Quentin looked up. "Well, that's good to hear, son. Who's the poet?" he asked. "Goes by J. Isaacs," Adrian said. "Don't know much more yet. I'll send you a few of the poems to read." Quentin chuckled. "You should send me all the submissions. Let me give my 2 cents. Adrian could only grin. "Careful, Dad. Say things like that, and I might talk you into coming out of retirement." Quentin's smile softened. but the silence that followed had a weight to it. Adrian looked out over the water. "I bet Mom would have loved to see you back in business," he said quietly. Quentin's gaze stayed on the horizon for a long moment. "Don't know about that. If I'd retired sooner, I would have had more time with your mother." The words hung in the air. He didn't look at Adrian as he cast his line, the rod arcing out into the water. As they fished in the fading light, Adrian turned the idea of his dad coming back to work over in his mind. Even if it was just part-time, it could give Quentin purpose again and take some of the weight off Adrian's shoulders, or allow him to step away altogether. Adrian wanted Harbor Lights to thrive, but he also wanted more. A larger publication, a wider audience, a career that stretched beyond Windermere's docks. But he didn't know how to tell his father that. Maybe he didn't need to. Not now, at least. Not if the right story or the right poet could help the magazine break into a wider spotlight. Who knew? Maybe the attention of a growing audience could be just the spark that drew his father back into the fold. Chapter 3. The latest issue of Harbor Lights Literary Journal lay on the kitchen table along with an unopened letter. Juliet's fingers hesitated before flipping to the poetry section, and there they were, her words printed in black and white for anyone to see. Her pulse fluttered. She read the lines twice, hardly believing they belonged to her. Anxiety had clawed at Juliet for weeks after she mailed her application. She'd spent one sleepless night convinced she'd misaddressed the envelope. Another afternoon, she'd filled a page in her journal with all the possible ways the editors could dismiss her work. On grocery delivery day, she'd checked her email every hour, certain a rejection must have arrived, despite the fact she hadn't even provided Harbor Lights with her email address. And once, while boiling water for tea, she mentally composed a follow-up letter, withdrawing her application altogether. "Think I might be going crazier than usual," Juliet said with a dry smile one Tuesday morning, adjusting her laptop so Dr. Lewis could see her face on the video call. "That's quite a claim," he replied lightly. "What's going on this week?" She told him about the application and how her thoughts kept circling back to all the ways it could go wrong. "Do you think this ties back to the car crash?" he asked. Juliet thought about it, then shook her head. "No, I think this is just me. Like, maybe the panic attacks have been going on for so long now that being anxious even about little things that aren't really dangerous just feels normal. Like it's my default setting now." Dr. Lewis smiled faintly. "Awareness is good. You can't challenge what you don't notice. And since you already acknowledge that this isn't dangerous or life-threatening, let's try a thought experiment." She tilted her head. "Okay," she said. "You once told me that after you could ride in a car again, one of your next stretch goals would be to enjoy a roller coaster. Is that right?" Juliet's mouth curved faintly. "Yes, I loved them as a teenager," she said. "How did you feel waiting in line for one?" Dr. Lewis asked. Juliet thought for a moment. "Butterflies in my stomach, muscles tight. My heart would be racing," he nodded. "Now imagine describing those same sensations in less positive terms. Your stomach clenching, your pulse pounding, your body on alert. Sounds a lot like anxiety, doesn't it?" Juliet blinked. "Yeah, it's almost the same thing." Before the roller coaster, you framed those feelings as anticipation for something thrilling. What would happen if you tried to frame your current feelings about the poetry application the same way? This technique may not work for your broader anxiety, but I think it could help you better process your feelings about this situation, he said. She let the thought settle, then nodded slowly. "I'll give it a try." Surprisingly, it helped. That is, until the day a letter arrived from the Harbor Lights Literary Journal. She hadn't ventured out to the mailbox until evening, when she was less likely to run into anyone. When she saw the sleek envelope sitting in her mailbox, Juliet slammed the lid closed. "Safe. You're safe," Juliet reminded herself. With another deep breath, she opened the mailbox and plucked out the letter. Her heart raced faster than her legs as she hurried back to the cottage. Inside, Juliet had tried to sit in her favorite armchair to read the letter, but soon found herself circling the living room, clutching the unopened envelope to her chest. She stopped, abruptly, then shoved the letter under a couch cushion and promptly went to bed. The next morning, Juliet woke at her usual dawn hour but stayed under the covers, watching the pale light slowly brighten the room. Only when the sun had cleared the trees did she push herself up. When she finally made her way downstairs, she breathed deeply, crossed to the living room, and pulled the envelope from beneath the couch cushion. She sat, hands trembling, and broke the seal. The sheet bore the magazine's elegant letterhead. She'd opened it with cautious fingers. "Dear J. Isaacs, it is my great pleasure to inform you that you have been selected as the Harbor Lights Literary Journal resident poet for the upcoming year. Your submission stood out among many for its clarity, emotional depth, and craftsmanship. The resident poet role includes contributing one original poem each month for our publication, along with occasional features in special issues. Our editorial team is eager to collaborate with you and support your creative vision. Please confirm your acceptance by returning the enclosed form at your earliest convenience. I look forward to reading more of your work in the months ahead. Sincerely, Adrian Blake, Editor, Harbor Lights Literary Journal." She sat for a long time after reading it. Was this wise? Was she tempting fate by putting herself out there? Old fears whispered that she was setting herself up for disaster. Her breath hitched, but she closed her eyes and tried to reframe the sensation. The nerves humming through her like a power line weren't harbingers of dread and doom, but a natural reaction to the spark of possibility. She was safe. No one was asking her to leave her house. She could write from here and send off her words like messages in bottles. It was a small step, but, as Dr. Lewis always reminded her, even the smallest steps were still growth. So Juliet filled out the enclosed paperwork, and now, several weeks later, held in her hand the first Harbor Lights issue to feature her writing. As she traced the lines of her published poem, the other envelope caught her eye. She'd been surprised to find it in the mailbox. Normally, she'd expect bills or letters from her aunt's estate planner, maybe the occasional piece of junk mail. But this letter had been tucked next to the magazine, addressed specifically to her in neat, deliberate handwriting she didn't recognize. She slid a letter opener under the flap and unfolded the page. "Dear J. Isaacs, I wanted to personally thank you for your beautiful poem in this month's issue. We're thrilled to have you on board as our resident poet. When I read your submission, I was genuinely moved by the quiet power in your lines. There was an emotional undercurrent to your work that lingered long after the last word. Your voice has a rare clarity to it, and I imagine our readers will be eager for more. If you ever want to discuss upcoming issues or have questions about the role, feel free to reach out. Again, welcome. It's an honor to publish your work. Warm regards, Adrian Blake." The warmth in his words touched her. She ought to write back, but it had been so long since she'd talked to anyone outside of Dr. Lewis or her aunt's estate lawyer. Still, Mr. Blake had given her a chance. The least she could do was acknowledge it. She pulled out her stationery and wrote a short note. Then she folded it, sealed it, and jogged it over to the green mailbox at the end of the lane. As she opened the creaking lid and slipped the letter inside, a construction truck turned the corner. Juliet startled, stepping quickly back toward her gate. Her heart slowed once safely back inside the cottage, and her thoughts began to drift to the man who would read her letter. She pictured an older, bearded editor in a cardigan with elbow patches, someone who smoked a pipe and used the word indeed a lot. She laughed softly at herself, then walked to the kitchen and, on a whim, opened her laptop. She typed in, Adrian Blake, Harbor Lights Literary Journal. The results loaded instantly. Oh, she breathed. He wasn't old at all. He was young, handsome, gorgeous actually. Dark eyes, an easy smile, and sharp cheekbones that made her stomach flutter. Oh no, Juliet breathed. Suddenly, her letter felt too brief, too polite. Was it bordering on robotic? Definitely too cold. What if he found the writing stiff? Or worse, ungrateful? Juliet's mind spiraled. She peeked out the window towards the mailbox. Through the trees and brush, she could make out the construction crew parked in the street. Well, that was just perfect. There was no getting it back now. Chapter 4. Adrian was halfway through revising a feature article about a local playwright when Gus tapped twice on the doorframe and leaned in with a small stack of mail. Hot off the press, Gus said, tossing the bundle onto Adrian's desk. And by hot, I mean mostly overdue invoices and a catalog from that weird literary pen company again, he said. Adrian smirked and thumbed through the stack. An envelope near the bottom caught his eye. J. Isaacs was written above the return address. So, Gus said, leaning against the doorframe. Did our mystery poet finally write back? Adrian looked up. Looks like it. Gus grinned. I'm still betting it's some retired fisherman with a thesaurus. Adrian chuckled. You need a new theory, Gus, he said. Until proven otherwise, I'm calling him John, Gus said, already turning back toward the design room. John Isaacs, it has a ring to it, don't you think? He called back to Adrian on his way out. Adrian turned his attention back to the letter in his hands. Dear Mr. Blake, thank you for your kind letter. It means a great deal to know the poem resonated with you and with the readers. I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given me. I'll do my best to send work worthy of the Harbor Lights Literary Journal. Sincerely, J. Isaacs. Adrian smiled. The letter's brevity didn't bother him. He sensed humility and perhaps a certain reserve, but that made sense for a poet who wished to remain anonymous. He glanced at the address. Winmere, same as the magazine. His poet was local. I guess I'll call you John for now, Adrian said to the letter. When John's next submission arrived, a poem titled Morning Light on Hollow Shore, Adrian had dropped everything to read it. It was stunning, spare and lyrical. It carried the same emotional precision as the first poem, like a story beginning to bloom. There was a line near the end that caught Adrian by the throat. Grief folds itself into the quiet corners of my day. There was pain in those words, and not just imagined, real. He knew that type of pain. The loss of his mother had hollowed out a part of him he still didn't have words for. The poem brushed against that rawness inside Adrian. He sat back and stared at the ceiling. John was clearly an old soul. And based on the first batch of poems that had come in with the application, John was certainly lonely. Adrian knew that feeling too. He reached for his pen, deciding then and there to try to be a friend to this mystery poet. It felt like John might need one. Dear Jay, your latest poem was deeply moving. Your portrayal of grief stayed with me long after I read it. I imagine writing about such things isn't easy, but I hope you know it matters. That your words can mean something to someone you've never even met. They certainly did for me. I'd be glad to hear more about what inspires your work if you'd ever care to share. In any case, I look forward to your next submission. With appreciation, Adrian Blake. As he slid J. Isaacs' poem into a protective sleeve, Adrian thought about showing it to his dad. Quentin still asked about new submissions, his voice hungry for the details. Yet when Adrian offered to bring pages over, his father always waved him off, muttering something about too many years lost to deadlines. The contradiction left Adrian unsettled, like watching a man tug against his own leash. He put the poem away. Perhaps he'd try sharing it with his dad another day. 2 weeks later, another envelope landed on his desk. He slid it open and unfolded a single sheet of cream stationery. Dear Adrian, thank you for your kind words about the latest poem. In a way, I supposed my life really is measured out by coffee spoons, but writing helps break up the monotony. I think much of what I write comes from a longing for what was, before certain losses, before certain changes. I write to remember how life used to feel, and I write to remind myself of the beautiful things I can still find in my daily life. A shaft of light that hits my bookcase just so, the roar of the ocean in the mornings. These things remind me to keep going, even if I can't live my life as I once did. May I ask what drew you to this work? Editing, I mean. Sincerely, J. Isaacs. Adrian leaned back in his chair. John had asked a question about him. Adrian hadn't expected that. His hunch was right. This wasn't just a poet mailing in verses. Whoever J. Isaacs was, they were reaching out, even if the hand doing so was tentative. I've got you, John, Adrian thought to himself as he grabbed a piece of stationery and set his pen to the page. Dear Jay, thank you for your thoughtful letter. I was struck by what you shared about writing from longing and memory. It takes a certain honesty to put that on the page. As for your question, I came to editing by way of study first and family second. I earned a master's in English literature and thought for a while that I might teach. But my father founded Harbor Lights, and when he stepped back from the magazine a few years past for personal reasons, I found myself carrying it on. I've been surprised to find that one of my favorite parts of editing is the people I work with. The chance to help someone's words find their way into the world makes it all feel more worthwhile. I'm glad to be doing that with your poems. With appreciation, Adrian Blake. The letters continued, first every 2 weeks, then nearly every week. A quiet camaraderie forming between them. They swapped thoughts on books, weather, and the quirks of Windermere life, alongside their talk of poetry. Adrian learned John also had a degree in English literature and had briefly been a high school English teacher. Adrian, in turn, shared that he'd briefly considered becoming a historian. John's response had sealed their friendship. Dear Adrian, a historian? You would have abandoned the noble pursuit of English literature to go cavorting with historians? Betrayal, treachery. I confess I received this news with something akin to the grief of Achilles upon the death of Patroclus. Admittedly, perhaps with fewer war cries, though the temptation was there. May you never again consider trading your Norton anthology for dusty census records. And if you do hear that siren call once more, allow me to remind you, literature is history. Beowulf preserves not only the rhythm of Old English, but also the values, fears, and aspirations of its age. And most importantly, the dangers of dragons lurking at the edges of human endeavor. The Epic of Gilgamesh is no mere myth, but a record of the restless yearning that has haunted humanity since its earliest cities were built. To study literature, then, is not to abandon history, but embrace it in its fullest, most human form. Sincerely, J. Isaacs. P.S. When future generations wish to understand our times, will they consult Twilight and unfortunately learn that ours was a civilization obsessed with brooding immortals and questionable love triangles? One Friday, after receiving a particularly interesting letter expounding on the economic motif in William Carlos Williams' Paterson, Adrian found himself running late. It had been a particularly busy Friday afternoon, and the letter sat unopened for hours. He'd rushed to finish his final task for the day so he could read it before heading out to meet a friend. But before he knew it, Adrian had been halfway through writing a response on the merits of modernist poetry when his phone vibrated. The word "here" flashed on the screen. Adrian quickly gathered his things and darted out the door. he found Will, his former college roommate turned public defender, seated in a hole-in-the-wall fish and chips spot a few blocks from the office. "Hey man, thought you were abandoning me there for a minute," Will said. "Wouldn't dream of it," Adrian replied. They chatted and ordered food. The two were halfway through their meal when Will swiped a fry from Adrian's tray, saying, "You've been in a weirdly good mood lately? Magazine doing better than usual or something?" he asked. "Yeah," Adrian said, sipping his drink. "We landed a really great resident poet this year. Local, talented, bit of a mystery though." Will raised a brow. "Mystery, huh? How so?" "Well, I gather he's a loner, some old man who doesn't have anyone around to talk to. His work has such a poignant wistfulness to it that has really resonated with our readers. He's actually become a bit of a pen pal of all things." Will grinned. "A pen pal, dude? What are we, 12? We've really got to get you a girlfriend, man." Adrian only smiled and changed the subject. A week later, the next letter arrived. What began as a familiar ritual, the letter opener, a smile, a quiet moment, ended with Adrian staggering back into his chair as the letter's contents unraveled everything he thought he'd understood about John. Chapter 5. Juliet reread Adrian's latest letter. "I'm afraid to admit to you that for most of my life, I wasn't really a poetry guy. I liked the idea of poetry, but if I actually picked something up, it usually felt like being handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Novels were safer. You could sink into the world, follow the characters, close the book, feeling like you'd been somewhere. Poetry, on the other hand, usually left me feeling like I'd shown up late to the party and missed the point. Then I read Claudia Rankine's Citizen. Honestly, it knocked me sideways. I'd never read something that called itself poetry but looked and read like that. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't poetic in the way I'd always imagined poetry was supposed to be. And somehow that made it more poetic than anything else I'd seen." Adrian's handwriting slanted slightly to the right, firm but open. Unbidden, Juliet's thumb caressed the pen strokes. She folded the letter carefully and glanced at the book that had come with it. He hadn't just recommended Citizen. He'd sent her his own copy. It had arrived carefully wrapped in brown paper. A pale blue sticky note on the inside cover read, "It's marked up like crazy. Hope you don't mind. Adrian." Juliet ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the book. The pages were feathered at the edges, dog-eared in places, with lines underlined in pencil and ink. She'd thumbed through the book and seen notes jotted in the margins, and sometimes just a single exclamation point or a word circled, giving her flashes of Adrian's reactions. She could see where his brain had caught, where he'd paused, where he'd thought. He said in his letter that Citizen was what first made him believe the magazine should feature a resident poet each year. And he had chosen her this year. Her. Juliet sat slowly on the couch, book in hand, knees curled beneath her. The wind was coming in off the ocean. She could hear the push and pull of it against the porch rail. She opened the first page. The writing gripped her immediately. It wasn't like anything she'd read in school or the anthologies that lined her bookshelf. Halfway down one of the pages, she found a note scribbled in the margin. "This line hit harder on the third read." She smiled before she could stop herself. It was as if Adrian were sitting here beside her, having a conversation. She leaned back into the couch cushions, letting her eyes close for a second. The ache in her chest was familiar. She missed her aunt. They used to sit here together, sometimes for hours. Juliet would curl up on the couch as Aunt Miriam took to her favorite armchair with a throw blanket over her lap. Even now, Juliet could almost smell the staple mug of mint tea going cool on the side table as her aunt read. On library days, Aunt Miriam would sometimes check out matching copies of a novel. Never something too heavy, They'd read the book together in the living room. Every few chapters, they'd pause to talk through what they loved and guessed what would happen next. Those afternoons had been her anchor. Even when her world shrank down to porch steps and narrow routines, her aunt had been her tether to something steady. They didn't need to talk about the accident or the grief that shadowed her days. Just being together was enough, until it wasn't. Her aunt had gone quietly in her sleep 2 winters ago. No illness, no hospital bed, just a soft morning that came and found the house a little emptier. In the days that followed, Juliet's life shrank down to a world of one. The silence stretched. No one called except for the lawyer handling her aunt's estate, and he preferred email when possible. There were a few cousins to notify, twice removed and once close, but after exchanging polite condolences, they didn't call again. Days folded into one another until time became more suggestion than structure. Groceries arrived once a week in brown paper bags. All bills were paid online, essentials delivered. She took her tea alone. It went on like that for nearly a year, until, one afternoon, while sorting through her aunt's closet, she found a dusty shoebox wedged behind a stack of photo albums. Inside were photographs her aunt had never shared, sun-bleached Polaroids from a beach trip in the 70s, postcards tucked between old ticket stubs, and a handful of smiling, silly, striking moments. There was one picture of Aunt Miriam barefoot on a dock, laughing, eyes squinting at the sun, that Juliet kept returning to. She looked young, free, alive in a way that Juliet hadn't felt in years. That night, Juliet sat in her aunt's favorite armchair, the photo resting on the side table. She was plagued by one question. When was the last time I laughed like that? Before the accident, before fear had taken up permanent residence inside her chest. She picked up the picture again, her aunt's laughing eyes beckoning her, challenging her. The next day, she looked up therapists who offered virtual sessions. She found one, Dr. Lewis, whose profile mentioned experience with trauma and anxiety. They began slowly, once a week, video calls that sometimes consisted of more silence than speech. But in time, she found herself speaking more, sitting straighter, listening not just to him, but to herself. He'd encouraged her to find a doctor she could see remotely. She'd been given medication to help with the anxiety and got set up with a prescription delivery service. But it was many more months of therapy before she was willing to set foot off the cottage's property. It was Dr. Lewis who had first suggested she try to reclaim the beach. "You don't have to talk to anyone," he said. "You don't even have to stay there long. Just step outside the gate, see the ocean again. Let it remind you that there's still movement, even when everything else feels stuck." It took her 3 weeks to work up to it, but on a morning in early spring, wrapped in a too large coat, she crept down the path from her back porch and stood at the edge of the shore. The sea was louder than she remembered. She didn't stay long, but when she came back inside, she wrote a poem, and then another. That was the beginning. And now, months later, she sat on the same couch where she and her aunt had read together, with a stranger's marked-up copy of Citizen open in her lap. Her alarm sounded. It was time for her call with Dr. Lewis. "You're smiling. Something good happen?" he said when the video connected. "I got a gift today, actually." "Tell me more," he prompted. "Well, I've been exchanging letters with Adrian, and today he sent me a book along with his letter." Dr. Lewis nodded. "It sounds like this brought up some joy. Are there any other emotions coming up for you? In the past, new connections have sometimes stirred anxiety." "Well, Adrian did at first, but I've really come to enjoy the letters. I like him." She heard the words come out of her mouth and felt heat rise in her cheeks. I like talking to him. It's the first time I've wanted to to know someone in a while. It's meaningful that you're even considering connection again. That's a big shift from where we started. But I'm curious, now that you know this, what do you want to do with that desire for connection? Dr. Lewis asked. Honestly, I want a real friendship, but going down that road again feels foolish. None of my other friends wanted to stick around because I was just too much for them. He'll probably just think the same. It sounds like you're predicting his response based on past experiences. What about letting Adrian respond for himself? Dr. Lewis asked. Juliet picked a thread on her sweater. I suppose you're right. So, if I understand you correctly, you want a friendship with Adrian, but you can't build a deep connection without some truth. And from everything you've told me, it sounds like there's a lot you're holding back. Well, what am I supposed to do? Tell him, hi, my name's Juliet. I have panic attacks because of a terrible car accident and I haven't properly left my house in 3 years. Please be my friend, she exclaimed. I hear you and agree that feels like a lot. But remember, you get to decide what feels safe to share and when. And you certainly don't need to share everything all at once. What's one small, manageable way you could be more open with him? She thought of the letters, how Adrian always started them out with, Dear Jay. My name, she said. I could tell him my first name, and maybe give him my email? Email would make it a lot easier to talk to each other. Dr. Lewis smiled. Small steps forward are still progress. That afternoon, she cleared a space on the kitchen table and set out her stationery. For once, she didn't debate every word choice. Instead, she just wrote. Dear Adrian, first of all, thank you for sending me Citizen. I wasn't sure what to expect when I pulled it from the envelope. I've only just begun, but already I see what you mean. The directness surprised me. The way Rankin folds something as ordinary as a passing comment into something that lingers like a bruise. It doesn't feel like poetry in the way I was trained to expect, but I think that's part of the power, isn't it? I can already tell I'll truly treasure your gift. And if I'm being honest, I've come to really treasure your letters these past months. Seeing a new envelope from you in my mailbox is often the highlight of my day. But as I'm reading through Citizen and seeing all your thoughtful margin notes, I find the letters might be a bit too slow for the conversations I'd like to have with you. So, here's my proposal. As I read through Citizen, what if we also wrote to each other by email? No pressure, but if you're open to it, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on the book. And before I sign off, there's one more thing. It's no secret that I value my privacy and have tried to keep myself mostly anonymous, but your thoughtfulness in sending me Citizen made me want to offer something back in return. A small token, but an honest one. So here it is. My name is Juliet. Yours, now less of a stranger, Juliet. She read it twice, then folded the page before she could change her mind. She slipped it into an envelope, addressed it, and carried it to the green mailbox at the end of the lane. The lid sighed. The letter slid away. Back in the cottage, she stood at the window until the gulls stopped arguing and the light shifted from white to pewter. Fear hummed. Had she said too much? Not enough? No. She wouldn't doubt herself. She was moving forward, one small step at a time. Chapter 6. Juliet. Her name was Juliet. Adrian had read the final lines of the letter 3 times before setting it down. He stared at the screen of his laptop later that evening, the letter propped beside him like a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He'd imagined John as a quiet older man, someone who lived alone by the sea. Some days, the voice behind the poems had felt like a widower, others a retired professor with regrets and spare time. But Juliet? He told himself it didn't change anything. Old man or old woman or anyone in between, Juliet had been a steady, remarkable presence in his life for months now. That didn't vanish with a name. Now, why couldn't his nerves just get the memo? He pushed them aside and started a draft email. Hi, Juliet. I'm really honored that you felt comfortable enough to share your name with me. I'd love to keep talking, whatever format that takes, and I'm excited to hear more about your thoughts on Citizen. I'm glad you've been liking it so far. Adrian. She responded the next morning. Hi, Adrian. Honestly, I was nervous about telling you my name, but you've been so kind to me over these last few months, and I really feel as if I know you. There's just one thing. Can you please continue to omit my full name for Harbor Lights? I'm not ready for others to know yet. Besides, what's a poet without a little mystery, after all? She went on to talk about the progress she'd made reading through Citizen. Adrian eagerly typed his reply. Their emails came every few days, sometimes daily, and soon were filled with much more than just their correspondence about the poetry book he'd sent her. Adrian told her about the chaos of production week at Harbor Lights, and she talked about how fog had begun to roll in heavy and low some mornings. They swapped notes on half-remembered literary arguments from grad school and how terrible most movie adaptations of books tended to be. The awkwardness Adrian initially feared from talking to an older woman instead of an older man never materialized. It felt natural, easy. Then, the job posting appeared. Adrian hadn't been seriously looking for work, but when a buddy from college forwarded him the listing for a full-time, remote editor position at Beacon Row Books in Boston, he had to learn more. The job came with benefits, flexible hours, and a chance to work for a national publisher from his own kitchen table. He could stay in Windermere near his dad. But what would Dad think? Adrian's gentle nudges to push his father back toward working with the magazine had been fruitless. Would Quentin Blake feel his son was abandoning the family business? Then again, Adrian had always said he'd move on eventually. He needed to think. He needed advice. He opened his email and began to type. Juliet replied within a few hours. That's a hard one, but coming from someone who lives with a lot of regret, I think you need to ask yourself how you'll look back on this missed opportunity. Is the comfort of the familiar really a strong enough reason to stay where you are? Your father had a chance to build his dream. Isn't it only fair you give yourself that same opportunity? After a day of wrestling, Adrian started his application. He didn't tell his dad, not yet. Later that week, he met up with Will again and unloaded his apprehensions. I just keep thinking about how much Dad gave up to build Harbor Lights. He started it when he was younger than I am now with nothing but a used desk, a typewriter, and stubbornness. Adrian said. And you helped keep it alive, man, Will said. You stepped in when he needed to, and let's be real, dude, in the last few years you've carried it further than most small-town lit mags ever get. Not to play devil's advocate or anything, but isn't the challenge of trying to take the magazine even further more exciting than this new job with Beacon? Will asked. To the right person, sure, Adrian said. But I've always wanted to work in publishing, Will. Real publishing. Books, big projects. I want to work with stories that don't just make it into local mailboxes and recycling bins. He added. Fair enough. So what's holding you back? Will asked. I just never know how Dad will react when it comes to the magazine. Half the time he talks like he misses the work so badly, and the other half he acts like the magazine stole decades he should have spent with Mom. Will raised a brow. Was that true? He asked. No, Adrian said firmly. Not even close. Mom was his biggest cheerleader. She loved that he was passionate about Harbor Lights. And he actually balanced it pretty well. The only person who thinks the magazine came before our family is him. It's like, since my mom died, he's rewritten history. Will leaned back. That's rough, man. But you know, technically, there's nothing to tell him yet. This could all come to nothing. You haven't even gotten an interview. Your dad's gone through enough painful things these past few years. Why bring up something that could ruffle his feathers before you even know if anything will come from it? At least wait until you've got an interview, dude. Adrian stared out the window for a moment. Hadn't considered that angle, he said. I hang out with a lot of lawyers. I'm good at putting the spin on things, Will said, grinning. Take my advice and wait to tell your dad until there's something to actually tell him. Adrian finally cracked a smile. Thanks, man. Will lifted his beer in salute. Now, on to less depressing topics. You still writing letters to that pen pal like a lame 6th grader? Adrian rolled his eyes. She's not my pen pal. She? Will leaned forward. Hold on, I thought you said you were talking to some old man. Adrian chuckled. Her name's Juliet. She told me a few weeks ago. We're emailing now instead of writing letters, actually. Will waggled his eyebrows. Really taking things to the next level there, dude, he joked. Shut up, Will. It's not like that. She's some lonely old lady who just needs a friend. Will leaned back, grinning. Okay. So, what do you actually know about her? Adrian sipped his drink. Not much. She used to teach high school English, went to Merrick University. Will, now clearly intrigued, pulled out his phone. Let's look her up, dude. Don't do that, Adrian said. Why not? Because she probably graduated in the 70s and lives in a cottage with 5 cats. It's not like she's on Instagram or anything, Adrian answered. Will ignored him. What's her full name again? He asked. Adrian sighed. Juliet Isaacs. Will typed fast. Juliet Isaacs, Merrick University. Hold up. He stared at the screen a beat before turning it toward Adrian. You've got to see this, man. Adrian leaned in. It was a student article from 7 years ago about the university's poetry club. He recognized one of the poems featured in the story from Juliet's resident poet application. As he scrolled down the page, he spied a photo of a woman. She looked up at him from the screen. Sunlight caught the corner of her hair in the picture. Warm eyes, wide smile. She was beautiful. Adrian stared, then caught the photo's caption. Poetry Club President Juliet Isaacs. Not who you were picturing, huh? Will said with a low whistle. No, Adrian murmured. Not even close. Chapter 7. Was this flirting? Juliet read Adrian's email again, wishing for the nth time she could hear his voice speaking the words out to her. Juliet, got some exciting news today. Beacon Row Books liked my application. They've asked me to interview, so now I have you to thank for being a bundle of nerves. But in all seriousness, I'm glad you pushed me to apply. You were right. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what if. If I do get the job, I'll owe you at least a coffee, maybe dinner, possibly both, depending on how shamelessly you'd like to take advantage of your influence on me. Though truthfully, I wouldn't complain about any of the above options. I'll keep you posted, Adrian. Juliet let the screen go dim and stared at her reflection for a beat. This was flirting, right? Possibly. Probably? Her chest gave that unexpected flutter again. The flutter had been happening more lately as her correspondence with Adrian had taken on a decidedly friendlier tone. Technically, she'd been the one to start it when she teased him in one email about his read on Ginsberg's Howl. He'd teased her back, and now their exchanges verged on flirtatious. The shifting tone of her correspondence with Adrian wasn't the only recent change in her life. 2 weeks ago, on her dawn walk, a man and his dog had passed her near the tide line. The dog barked, the man nodded. For half a second, her body said, "Run." But she didn't. She stayed, breathed, watched the dog's tail helicopter into the morning. Then, last Wednesday, an older woman with a zingy purple windbreaker smiled at Juliet as she crossed the dunes. Juliet smiled back. On Tuesday, she told Dr. Lewis she felt ready for a new assignment. That's encouraging to hear, he said, his expression steady and warm in the small video window on her laptop. What kind of step forward feels possible right now? He asked. Juliet hesitated. Well, anything involving a car is still a no for me, so I'm not sure what that would be. Dr. Lewis nodded. That makes sense. Let's approach it from another angle. What's something you've missed from life before you stopped leaving the cottage? She thought for a moment. Library visits with Aunt Miriam. We used to go once a week until my panic attacks got too severe. That sounds like a meaningful routine. Is the library nearby? He asked. She nodded. It's within walking distance. Dr. Lewis smiled gently. That could be a good fit then. Familiar, low stress, and within your comfort zone. Plus, most libraries have self-checkout these days, so you could conceivably accomplish your goal without interacting with anyone directly until you're ready for that step. How would it feel to plan a short visit sometime this week? They mapped it out in steps. She'd start with short walks at first, early in the morning on weekdays when it would be quiet. Her first goal was to make it to the end of the street. The next day, she could go a block further and so on until she was ready to make it to the library. The first morning, she only made it as far as the mailbox. The second, she crossed to the opposite sidewalk. By the fifth, she was able to get several blocks past the cottage. 3 weeks later, and she was consistently walking to the library itself. She loved seeing the building in the early morning mist, partially illuminated by lampposts that hadn't turned off for the morning yet. When she reported her progress to Dr. Lewis, he encouraged her to move on to stage 2 of their plan, walking to the library during mid-mornings when she ran the risk of bumping into other people. She surprised herself with how quickly she graduated to the mid-morning walks. The night before she planned to brave going into the library itself, she messaged Adrian. I'm branching out of my shell a bit, trying a new routine. It's small, but I think you'd be proud. He replied less than an hour later. Already proud. No details necessary unless you feel like sharing. Just know I'm cheering. She read his note once more before bed and slept better than she had in a week. The next day, Juliet walked to the library. She kept her pace easy, past the hydrangea bushes and the corner cafe. Her breath rose steady and white in the cool morning air. When she reached the steps, she paused just long enough to hear her pulse slow in her ears. Then she opened the door. The lobby held a sleeping potted fern and a bulletin board full of flyers and advertisements. It was mostly empty. The library assistant manning the desk didn't even look up when she came in. No one needed anything from her. She didn't have to speak. She moved toward the back, past reference, and into fiction. Her fingers drifted along the row of books. She stood where the window light met carpet and let the quiet settle over her like a blanket. She was doing it. She slid a book partway off the shelf, The Remains of the Day, and read the first page standing there. She continued exploring, pulling a few more books from the shelves. Eventually, Juliet found a small desk tucked against a back window and settled down to continue reading. Lost in the joy of reclaiming the library, she didn't notice the gradual rise of voices in the building. As she finished her 5th chapter, Juliet's mind registered that the library was much louder than it had been earlier. A myriad of voices trickled through the building. She could hear the doors open and close repeatedly. She wasn't alone. Juliet closed the book and moved to the end of the aisle, peeking through a gap between the shelves. The front of the library had transformed while she'd been reading. A folding table was now stretched across the lobby, draped with a blue cloth. A handwritten sign in cheerful marker read, Local Authors Day. 3 volunteers arranged stacks of paperbacks. People streamed in. The volume swelled. Laughter ricocheted. A mic squealed and someone said, Testing, sorry. And the apology amplified made her flinch. She stepped back. Then she tucked herself into the back corner where travel guides met nonfiction essay collections. She slid down the wall and folded into the smallest shape she could make. Knees up, arms around, Head down. Ground, she told herself. Words like stones she'd laid out for just this path. 5 things I can see. The scuffed carpet, a dropped bookmark with a cartoon on it, a faint stain near the leg of the shelf, the softest edge of light pulling by her shoe, a brass screw holding the end cap in place. 4 sounds. The squeak of the cart, a baby's soft whine, the far-off thunk of the book drop swallowing a return. The murmur of voices swelled again. Her throat was closing up. 3 textures, Juliet, she reminded herself, and reached her hand down to the cool metal of the shelf. Next, she fingered the rough knit of her sleeve, then clutched one of the books hard in her palm. Her breath still skittered, too fast, too shallow. 2 scents. Lemon cleaner, musty paper. 1 thing I can taste. She tried to fish a tin of mints from her purse, but her hands were shaking too much. She couldn't breathe. The sharp crackle of the microphone set her teeth on edge. Juliet pressed her forehead into her knees, her nails biting into her palms. She tried again to name the things she could see, hear, and touch, but the list dissolved in the rising rush inside her chest. Her vision blurred at the edges. The carpet seemed to tilt. Her pulse hammered so hard she thought it might split her ribs apart. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, fighting to breathe, to ground herself. But the noise and the air and the weight of all those people pressed closer. And then the panic crested. Hot, unstoppable, absolute. Chapter 8. Adrian was in early. The office smelled of coffee grounds and printer toner when he dropped his bag by the desk and booted up his computer. He was taking a half day to attend an author's reading in the early afternoon, and he'd reserved the remainder of the day for prep time for his interview with Beacon Row. He was midway through reviewing page proofs when his phone lit up. Dad. Morning, Adrian answered. Morning. Quentin's voice was too casual. So, heard from Peter Donnelly today? Adrian stilled. Peter Donnelly? He said. The name sounded familiar. Yes, Quentin continued. Old buddy from college. Had quite a lot to tell me. Congratulations on the interview, by the way. Heat rose in Adrian's face. Dad, But Quentin cut him off. Now what I'm trying to wrap my mind around, son, is why I had to hear this from Peter instead of you, he said. Dad, I know how much the magazine means to you, Adrian began. I'm not disappointed that you're looking for another job, Adrian, his father said. I'm disappointed that you didn't trust your old man enough to tell him about it. Adrian rubbed his temple. It's not that I didn't trust you. Your mother and I spent half our lives raising you to be an honest man. This would have broken her heart. Dad, what would break Mom's heart is seeing you living like a husk of who you were, Adrian retorted. The silence pressed hard. We'll talk later, Adrian said finally, his throat tight. All right, Quentin said, and hung up. The call sat heavy in Adrian's chest. The rest of the morning blurred past. By the time he wrapped at noon, the earlier excitement had drained. He packed up his bag and left the office with a weight in his steps. The Windermere Public Library's parking lot was already half full when he pulled in. A banner hung near the front doors that read, Celebrating Local Voices. Inside, the lobby buzzed with chatter and the smell of coffee and paper cups. Adrian shook hands with Jonah Price, one of the breakout contributors to Harbor Lights, now a debut author. Big day, Adrian said, clapping Jonah's shoulder. Couldn't have done it without you guys, Jonah said, grinning wide. They were talking about Jonah's nerves when Adrian caught movement in his peripheral vision, someone slipping quickly between the stacks. A shadow of motion gone before he could track it. He blinked, but Jonah's voice pulled him back. The reading began soon after. Folding chairs lined the lobby, nearly all of them taken. Adrian gave up his seat to an elderly woman and walked back behind the rows of chairs. He leaned against the bookshelves, arms crossed, as Jonah began speaking into the mic. Adrian smiled faintly, but his attention snagged elsewhere. Faint, almost imperceptible, crying. So soft he was sure no one a few feet ahead in the chairs could hear it. Adrian frowned, slipped away from the group, and followed the sound. There, curled in the corner against the back wall, was a woman, arms tight around her knees, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Adrian froze. Juliet. He knew her from the photos Will had found, but seeing her in real life, small and weeping, knocked the air out of him. "Juliet?" he said softly. Her head jerked up, eyes wide, rimmed red. She looked startled, cornered. Adrian crouched a few feet away, palms open. "It's me, Adrian, from Harbor Lights." His voice was low, steady, like calming a spooked animal. "You don't have to talk." She gasped, shaky, clutching tighter at her coat. "Okay," he said gently. "Okay, we'll just breathe." He sat down slowly on the carpet across from her. "You're not alone. I'm right here." Her breaths came ragged, uneven. Adrian lifted his hand slightly, showing her, as he inhaled deliberately through his nose. "Try and take a deep breath," he murmured as he watched her hyperventilate. "We'll do something I learned after I lost my mom, okay? It's called box breathing. You're going to breathe in for 4 counts, then hold your breath for 4 counts, and then you'll breathe out for 4, like this." He took a breath slowly, held it, and then slowly breathed out. "Now you try." He counted softly, steady, not rushing her. "In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Her breath stuttered, but she tried again, then again. He kept the rhythm, hoping his voice helped anchor her. "I'm not leaving you," he said when her eyes flicked to him, desperate. "Not until you want me to. You don't have to do this alone." They stayed like that for what felt like an hour. The noise of the reading drifted in and out. The applause, the signing, the scrape of chairs. None of it touched them in their quiet pocket of the stacks. When the voices in the lobby thinned, Juliet's breathing had steadied. Her arms loosened around her knees. "Better?" Adrian asked softly. Her nod was slight, but it was there. He rose slowly, offering his hand. After a hesitation, she took it. "You want me to help you get home?" he asked softly. Juliet started to nod, then stopped. I don't want people to see me." "Okay, give me a second. I'll check if it's still busy out there," Adrian said quickly. He jogged down the row of shelves and leaned out into the lobby. The last of the crowd was drifting away, an older couple chatting with Jonah as he signed their book, as a librarian folded up the blue tablecloth. The rest of the chairs were already stacked against the wall. He came back to her. "It's mostly empty. If you want, I can walk you out. No one will notice." Juliet hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. "All right," Adrian murmured. He offered his hand again, and this time she gripped it firmly, as though it were the one steady thing in the room. Together they moved down the aisle, their footsteps soft against the carpet. She didn't let go, even as they stepped out of the stacks and into the lobby. Outside, the air was cool and smelled of rain. Adrian guided her toward the lot, toward his car. But as they neared, she stiffened, panic flaring in her eyes. "No cars," she begged. "Okay," he said quickly, hands raised. "We won't drive, I promise." She swallowed hard, trying to breathe again. "My place, it's close. Walking distance," she forced out. "Then we'll walk," Adrian said. The silence between them was fragile but not empty. Step by step, they made their way along the quiet streets toward her house. At her gate, she turned. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "But I'm okay now. You don't need to stay." He wanted to argue, but her eyes begged for space. "All right," he said gently, "but let me give you my number in case you need me." She pulled out her phone. After entering in the number Adrian gave her, she sent him a quick text so he had hers. Then with another shaky breath, she told him goodbye and walked inside her house. He stood there after she disappeared inside, the image of her crumpled on the library floor carved sharp in his mind. Chapter 9. Juliet woke with her throat tight, as though the night itself had tried to strangle the breath from her. Her body felt heavy, her skin too thin, the memory replayed in cruel detail. Her knees pulled to her chest, her breath ragged, Adrian's steady voice counting her through each inhale, the way she'd leaned against him, trembling, as though he were the only thing keeping her upright. She told herself she should be grateful, that he'd stayed, that he'd been kind, that he hadn't walked away. But shame was sharper than gratitude. It clawed its way through her ribs until she could hardly breathe. On the nightstand, her phone lit with a soft glow. "You okay this morning? No need to reply if you're resting," the text read. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Thank you, I'm fine," she typed, stared at it, then deleted it with a swipe. She turned off notifications, set the phone face down, and rolled back into the hollow of the pillow. For the next few days, silence became her shield. No letters, no emails, no poems submitted to Harbor Lights. She drafted lines in her journal but never sent them. How could she have let Adrian see her like that? See the true mess she was? She hadn't felt this stripped bare since that horrible last day teaching in her high school English classroom. The panic attack had started like all the others. Fast, merciless. A car outside had cut off another driver, and horns had blared. She remembered the screech of the chalk as her hand jumped, the blur of faces as her vision closed down to a pinpoint, the sound of chairs scraping as students shifted nervously as she bent to the ground, and then worst of all, a phone lifted, recording. She'd gone on leave, but the damage was done. Within days, parents were calling the school to complain. Principal Durst had summoned her to his office, his expression hard. "We can't keep putting up with these outbursts, Juliet. You need to get these things together or find another place to work." She had typed up her resignation letter that same night. The day after, she arrived on Aunt Miriam's doorstep with 2 suitcases and rain dripping from her hair. "Oh, honey, I'm glad you're here," Aunt Miriam said as Juliet walked through the threshold and into her embrace. After a long hug, Aunt Miriam stepped back and looked into Juliet's eyes. "You stay here as long as you need." Juliet nodded, then looked down as tears threatened to spill. That's when she noticed she'd tracked mud all across the entryway rug. She'd frozen, horrified. I'm so sorry, Aunt Miriam. I didn't mean..." Her aunt had looked down at the rug, then back at her with a wry smile. "What, that old thing? Good riddance. I always hated it. My late husband Harold picked it out, you know. You've improved it, if anything." But Juliet was already spiraling. What if she ruined something else of her aunt's? Would Aunt Miriam tire of her? What if her panic attacks got worse? Surely she'd become a burden. Surely she'd overstay her welcome. What if she never worked again, never paid her way, never proved she was worth the space she took up? The panic had closed in, her chest cinched tight. She'd sunk to the floor in tears, shoulders heaving, and Aunt Miriam had simply lowered herself beside her, wrapped her arms around Juliet and stroked her hair. "Shh, easy, sweetheart. You're safe." She'd hushed her gently, the same way she had when Juliet was a child, barefoot in her aunt's yard, crying over a bee sting. The memory burned now, sweet and searing. How badly she wanted her aunt back. The comfort of someone who knew her fear and didn't flinch. But Aunt Miriam was gone, and Adrian had seen too much. She canceled her next appointment with Dr. Lewis. She was a failure. What good did it do to keep trying to step into the world again? She already knew what would come of those efforts. Adrian's last text glowed in her memory, still unanswered. "You okay?" She wasn't, and she couldn't tell him. It was a mistake, all of it. Thinking she could return to normal life. Thinking someone like Adrian could see her panic and not see her as broken. Better for him if she stayed away. And life was certainly better for her in the quiet safety of her aunt's cottage, alone. Chapter 10. The office was quiet, except for the faint hum of the old radiator and the shuffle of paper beneath Adrian's hands. It was late, too late for anyone else to still be there, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. The silence of the building only made Juliet's silence louder. She'd been absent from his inbox. No notes, no lines of poetry tucked neatly into his day. She was gone from his life as suddenly as she'd entered, leaving a hollow place he couldn't fill. He rubbed his eyes, then glanced down at the stack spread across his desk. Her letters. A whole correspondence in beautiful handwriting and careful words. The door creaked open. "Thought I'd find you here?" Adrian looked up to see his dad leaning in, a brown paper sack in one hand. Quentin held it up with a faint grin. "Burgers, just like old times." Adrian laughed lightly. "You're supposed to be retired. You shouldn't even remember what old times are." Quentin set the bag down on the desk and slid into the chair across from Adrian, beginning to unwrap a foil bundle. The smell of grilled onions filled the office. Adrian reached for his own burger, still warm. For a few moments they ate in companionable silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the crunch of fries. Finally, Quentin wiped his hands on a napkin. "How'd the interview go?" he asked. Adrian shrugged. "Fine. Nothing groundbreaking. I'm not holding my breath." Quentin studied him. "You shouldn't sell yourself short, Adrian. You've got the stuff they're looking for." Adrian changed the subject, shifting the stack of envelopes on his desk. But Quentin noticed. His eyes narrowed, curiosity softening into recognition. "Letters?" he asked. Adrian hesitated. "Yeah, from our resident poet, actually." Quentin's mouth curved. "Seems like you two are striking up quite the friendship." Adrian let out a humorless laugh. "I'm not so sure, Dad. She hasn't spoken to me in a while," he said. "Did you do something to make her mad?" Quentin teased lightly. "Not that I know of." Quentin leaned back, his expression softening. "I made your mother furious more times than I'd like to admit, but she could never hold a grudge, God love her." His voice grew quieter. "What I wouldn't give for just one more moment with her, even if she was yelling at me." Adrian's chest tightened. He glanced at his father, then down at his hands. "Probably would have yelled at you for staying away from the magazine. You promised her you were only stepping away temporarily, Dad." Quentin's jaw flexed, but he didn't deny it. "You don't need to come back if you don't want to," Adrian said carefully. "But, Dad, it's clear you're stagnating. You light up when you talk about Harbor Lights. I think you still want to be here." Quentin was silent for a long moment, then he sighed. "You're right. I do." His hand traced the edge of the desk, familiar grooves from decades of work. "But it's hard. Everyone says I built this place, but truth is, your mother was right there with me every step. Editing, proofing, pushing me when I wanted to give up. This magazine, it was hers as much as it was mine. She didn't want me to quit because she knew what it meant to us both. And when I did step back," his voice cracked slightly, "I wish I'd done it sooner, to have had more time with her." The ache in his words filled the room. Adrian swallowed, unsure what to say. Quentin straightened, eyes brighter now. "But maybe the best way to honor her isn't by grieving what we lost." He paused for a long moment before adding, "I think it's time to come back." Adrian let out a breath, something loosening in his chest. "She'd like that, Dad," he said. Quentin stood, gathering the burger wrappers. Before leaving, he gestured toward the pile of letters. "And son, whatever's in those letters, it clearly means something to you. Don't let it slip away too easily." The door clicked shut, leaving Adrian alone with the hum of the radiator and the letters spanned across his desk. He thought of Juliet, of her silence, of how badly he wanted to drive to her house and make sure she was okay. But he knew better. Pressing her would only push her further away. So instead, he pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and took up his pen. When he finished, he folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and stamped it. Then before he could second-guess himself, he left the building and walked down the quiet streets to the post office. The slot clanged softly as the letter disappeared inside. Adrian stood there for a long moment, the cool night air pressing against his skin. He told himself not to hope, but hope he did, always. Chapter 11. Juliet's teacup sat untouched on the end table, the steam long since vanished. On her laptop screen, Dr. Lewis leaned forward slightly, hands folded, his tone steady and warm. "Can you walk me through what happened at the library?" Juliet rubbed her palms against her knees. "I thought I was doing okay. I got there, I looked around, even read for a bit, but then more people came in. It felt like the walls were closing in." Her voice faltered. "I ended up on the floor in the corner. It feels like I'm back at square one." Dr. Lewis nodded slowly. "That sounds incredibly distressing. I want to acknowledge how hard that moment must have been for you." He paused. "But I also want to reflect something back. You walked through the doors. That's a significant step, especially given everything we've talked about over the past year." Her eyes dropped to her lap. "It doesn't feel like progress. I still panicked," she said. "I hear that, and it makes sense that it's discouraging, but trying isn't failing. You showed up, and that matters. Progress isn't always linear. It's often messy and uncomfortable." Juliet bit the inside of her cheek. "I guess." They sat in silence for a moment before Dr. Lewis asked, "Can I shift gears for a moment? I'm wondering, where does Adrian fit into all of this?" Her chest tightened. She thought of his texts, still unanswered, of the short poem she'd submitted to the magazine, stripped of the warm notes she used to include. "I haven't really talked to him," she said quietly. Dr. Lewis nodded. "What's been holding you back?" She looked away. "I don't want to get hurt." "By Adrian?" Dr. Lewis said. "By anyone. I've been rejected so many times, by friends, by coworkers, my old boss." Her voice quickened. "What if I let him in and he decides I'm too much? I feel like it's just easier to pull away now than wait for the fallout." Dr. Lewis tilted his head slightly. "It sounds like you're trying to protect yourself from pain. That's completely understandable. But I wonder, does pulling away feel protective, or does it feel punishing?" Juliet didn't answer. Dr. Lewis let the silence settle before continuing. "It's something to sit with. There's risk in opening up, absolutely. But there's also risk in shutting down every possibility of connection." 2 days later, the letter came. It sat on her kitchen table like a stone. She circled it for hours, made tea, washed dishes, pretended not to see Adrian's handwriting on the envelope. Finally, as rain needled against the windows and the cottage darkened, she slid her finger under the seal and unfolded the page. "Dear Juliet, your friendship has given me more than you realize. I won't pretend to fully understand what you're going through. I want you to know that I'm here if you ever need a friend. If you can't continue this friendship, I'll be thankful for every word you've shared and for the light you've brought into my life. Always, Adrian." Juliet pressed the page to her lips, eyes burning. His words were simple, but they undid her. No anger, no bitterness, just understanding. She hadn't wanted to admit it, not even to herself. But in that moment, it broke over her with the force of the tide. She was falling in love with him. She had been for months. The shame, the fear, the silence, it all bent beneath the truth of it. Juliet shoved her feet into boots. wrapped a coat around her shoulders, and stepped into the gently falling rain. She walked down the path over the dunes until the salt air slapped against her face and the wild wind tangled her hair. She filled her lungs with it, her whole body trembling, but not from panic this time. She felt alive. When she returned to the cottage, dripping from the rain, she didn't hesitate. She dried off, sat at her desk, and pulled a fresh page from her notebook. Chapter 12. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon. Thank you for your time and interest in Beacon Row Books. We had many excellent candidates this year, and while your credentials were impressive, we've decided to move forward with another applicant. Adrian closed the tab. His chest felt hollow but not surprised. He hadn't expected much after the lukewarm interview. Still, the rejection stung. That evening, Quentin poked his head into Adrian's office. "Well?" he prompted. "Didn't get it," Adrian said, leaning back in his chair. Quentin stepped inside, hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry, son." He hesitated. "But you know what? All that means is this wasn't the right opportunity for you. Something better will come along." Adrian tried for a smile. "Meanwhile," Quentin said with a grin, "you'll get the pleasure of working with your old man again." Adrian's smile was real this time. The next morning, Adrian rose at the same time, brewed his coffee the same way, drove the same familiar streets into town. He edited 2 stories, signed off on proofs for the anniversary issue, answered Gus's questions about the layout. His body moved through it all, but his mind felt far off, like he was watching his life from across the room. At lunch, he sat with Gus and his dad at the cafe across the street. They laughed about a typo caught in a headline and traded stories. But Adrian only half heard them. He stirred his soup long after it had cooled, smiling at the right moments, but feeling none of it. Back at his desk, he found himself opening the drawer where he kept the stack of Juliet's letters again, his fingertips brushing the envelopes as though they might whisper new insights about her, but they stayed silent. By the time he drove home, the harbor lights blinked against the early dark. He made dinner, stacked his dishes in the sink, looked out his window at the view of the harbor. The water was gray, flat. Later, stretched across his couch, he tried to read, but the words blurred. He gave up and went to bed. The next day began the same as the last one ended, quiet and hollow. He felt like someone had turned the dimmer switch all the way down on his life and left it there. Quentin noticed his son's dim mood at work. "You look awfully gray for a Friday. Something weighing on you, Adrian?" Adrian exhaled. "Juliet." His father settled into the opposite chair. "Tell me." Adrian stared at the floor. "She stopped writing, stopped texting. It's been weeks." Quentin tilted his head. "Were you two seeing each other?" he asked. "No." Adrian shook his head. "Just writing, talking. But I had feelings for her, real ones. And I thought maybe she felt something too. I wanted to try for more than friendship, but now..." He trailed off. Quentin's expression softened. "Break, break, break, oh thy cold gray stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me." Adrian looked up at his dad. "Tennyson?" he asked. Quentin nodded. "The one and only. It's a hard thing, caring for someone and losing them. But give it time, son," he said. I know, time heals all wounds," Adrian sighed. "No," his father said. "Time just gives you space to put those wounds into perspective, get some clarity. But healing, that's on you. You either tend to the wound or learn to live with the scar," Quentin said. "That, however, is not what I'm trying to tell you, son. Give this situation with Juliet some time. From everything you've told me about her, it's clear she's working through some hard things. You've got a good read on people. If you thought she cared about you, then she probably does." Adrian nodded. He'd give it time. The following Friday, a letter from Juliet appeared in his office mailbox. Adrian tore it open, pulse thudding. Inside was a page written in her neat hand, "He wishes for the cloths of heaven," by W.B. Yeats. Had I the heaven's embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silvered light, the bloom and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet, but I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. Below the poem, she'd written a note. Please don't give up on me, Juliet. Adrian sat frozen. His first instinct was to call her immediately. He quickly dialed her number and held the phone to his ear. But then he realized she might not be ready. She might need space to do this on her own terms. He hung up before she could answer, set the phone on his desk, and took a steadying breath. The phone lit up a moment later. A text. "Can I see you?" His heart slammed so hard he nearly dropped the phone. "Yes, anywhere you'd like," he typed back. The reply came quick. "The beach. Tomorrow morning at 6. There's a nice spot to sit behind my place." Adrian leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He was going to see Juliet. Chapter 13. She almost didn't go. The clock crept toward 6 as Juliet stood at the door, coat already buttoned, boots laced. Her hand hovered on the knob. She could almost feel the walls tugging her back, whispering that she wasn't ready, that she was safer here. She turned away once and took a shaky breath. Then she closed her eyes and repeated her mantra, "You're safe." The words steadied her just enough to make her reach for the handle again. She stepped outside, the dawn air sharp against her cheeks, the sea wind carrying the tang of salt. She walked down the narrow path, across the sand still cool with night, until she saw him. Adrian was there, sitting on a weathered bench tucked behind the dunes. He looked up at the sound of her steps, rising to his feet. "Hi," she whispered. "You came," he said. "I almost didn't." Her breath clouded in the cool air. Adrian gave her a soft smile. "I'm glad you did." They sat side by side, the waves stretching endless before them. Juliet's shoulders were stiff, her hands tight in her lap. Adrian noticed. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready," he said gently. "Do you want to talk, or should we just sit?" Her throat bobbed as she shook her head. Then, after a moment, she whispered, "I'd rather you talk." "All right." He leaned back against the bench, his gaze on the tide. "Harbor Lights has been its usual circus. Margaret is lobbying for a new font in the poetry section, and Gus keeps trying to convince me we need to run more crime stories. Local flavor, he calls it. Oh, and my dad's back in the office again." Juliet glanced sideways at him, curiosity flickering through her. "Just part-time," Adrian said, smiling faintly. "But still, having him around feels good, like he's come alive again." Her grip on her hands loosened. She seemed to be listening more easily now, the tightness around her eyes easing with each word. Adrian let the quiet stretch a beat before adding, I didn't get that job, by the way. The one with Beacon Row. They went another direction." Juliet's face softened, her nerves forgotten for a moment. "I'm so sorry," she said earnestly. He shrugged, though it was clear the sting was still there. "It's fine. It wasn't for me. Something else will come along." Juliet's gaze lingered on him, steady for the first time that morning. "I'm sure it will," she said. They sat in silence for a while more, and Juliet knew that it was time to give him an explanation for the cold shoulder she'd shown him. She drew in a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "About the library," she began. Adrian turned toward her, listening. She twisted her hands together. "That wasn't my first panic attack. I've been dealing with them for years. When I was a kid, there was a car accident and my parents," she swallowed. "They didn't make it." Adrian looked down at his hands. "I'm so sorry, Juliet." She took a deep breath and continued her story. "My great-aunt Miriam took me in after that. I suppose I was always a little anxious as a kid, but it was manageable. I got through school, had friends, went to college. Life was mostly normal." Adrian nodded gently. "So, what changed?" Juliet's laugh was humorless. "Another car crash. Not even serious. My friend Carrie was driving a group of us right before graduation, and she ran a stop sign. Nobody was really hurt, thank God, but it re-triggered everything from before. The fear came back, sharper than ever, and that's when the panic attacks started. They derailed everything. I didn't even get to walk at my own graduation. I worked so hard to get my master's degree, and I never even got to wear my hood. It's still just collecting dust in my closet with my cap and gown. The worst part was my friend Carrie felt so guilty that she pulled away. The others took sides, and most didn't pick me." Adrian's brow furrowed, but he stayed silent, letting her go on. "A few friends stayed, but I wasn't fun anymore. I didn't want to go bar hop or go to concerts or have big nights out. I think it was just too heavy hanging around me in that season, and eventually even the ones who tried to stay my friends just sort of drifted away. I already had a teaching job lined up, so I spent that summer after graduation trying out therapy and different combinations of meds, but the panic followed me into the classroom. The principal pretty much told me to shape up or ship out, so I quit, and that was it. My dreams of teaching and all the work it took to get me there were just gone. I moved back in with my aunt, and eventually I just stopped leaving the house. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face. She let them stay there, staring at the sand, her hands stilled, clenched tight in her lap again. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the surf. She didn't dare look at him. Then, gently, his hand slid over hers. Warm, solid. Her breath caught. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. The pressures of his fingers against hers said enough. Chapter 14. 4 months later, Juliet's year as the Harbor Lights resident poet was nearly done. She felt the bittersweet tug of it with every passing day. A year ago, she'd been afraid to even let one person see her poems. Now, those poems had carried her further than she thought, and Adrian had carried her too, supporting her as she embarked on more assignments from Dr. Lewis to stretch herself out of her comfort zone. The first time she stepped foot back into the library after her panic attack, Adrian had been there, walking with her through the aisles until her breath evened out. By the third trip, she was able to go on her own. Then came the coffee shop, a half-mile away. At first, Adrian had to leave her outside as he ordered for the two of them. They'd sip their drinks at the cafe table farthest from the door, but eventually she was able to go in alone, ordering tea with her hands only slightly trembling. And now, they were working on meeting people. Adrian had introduced her to his father Quentin at the library one afternoon, and she'd surprised herself by holding an easy conversation with him. Next week, Adrian was planning to bring his friend Will around. There were still hard days when she couldn't quite leave the cottage, times when her chest closed like a fist, but for the first time in years, the balance tilted toward hope. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Juliet opened it and burst out laughing. Adrian stood on the porch in a cap, gown, and deep blue academic hood. In one hand, he held a bouquet of daisies and irises. In the other, a plain brown paper bag. "What on earth is this?" she asked, grinning. He gave her his most serious look. "I'll explain after you go upstairs and put on your cap and gown. Bring your hood down too. Don't forget it," he said. "You're ridiculous, Adrian," Juliet replied. "I'm committed," he corrected, suppressing a smile. "Now go on." Still laughing, Juliet obeyed. She could hear rustling downstairs as she dug out the box from her closet where her regalia had gathered dust since grad school. Sliding the gown over her shoulders, she remembered how certain she'd been, back then, that her life was about to begin. Now, maybe it finally was. When she came downstairs, cap balanced on her head and hood draped over her arm, she stopped in her tracks. Adrian had transformed her living room. Streamers looped through the curtain rod, 2 candles flickered on the coffee table, and a banner reading "Congrats" hung crookedly against the far wall. On the table itself sat a spread of cheese, crackers, a bottle of sparkling cider with 2 glasses, and the newest issue of Harbor Lights, one she knew wasn't supposed to be mailed out for another few days. She gasped. "You got it early!" He grinned. "Perks of being the editor." He pulled out his phone, tapped a button, and the tinny sound of pomp and circumstance filled the room. "Juliet Isaacs, as you graduate from your position as resident poet of Harbor Lights, it is my honor to hood you." She doubled over laughing as he solemnly lifted the academic hood and settled it on her shoulders. When the mock ceremony was complete, they clinked glasses of sparkling cider. "To surviving a year with me as your editor," Adrian said. "To surviving a year with me as your poet," Juliet countered. Adrian smiled, though he didn't drink right away. For a moment, it looked like he might say something. He tapped his thumb lightly against the stem of his glass, gaze drifting to the copy of Harbor Lights resting on the table. Then he shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. He nodded toward the magazine. "Go on. Check your poem." She opened to the familiar section. She'd written her final poem about how silence initially imprisoned her, but how she discovered that the silence she carried could also offer a shield and comfort. But something new waited at the bottom. The last stanza of her poem had read, "If silence is discovery, then it is this, to notice one day that the quiet I once feared has begun to steady me, a shield drawn close, not emptiness but shelter." But beneath her words was a new final stanza, handwritten on the page in neat, dark ink. It was an answer to her poem that read, "If love is discovery, then it is this, to notice one day that the silence I once clung to is loosening its hold, opening and making space for another voice beside my own." Juliet looked up. Adrian's gaze was steady, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "I love you, Juliet. I have for a while now. I wasn't sure if you were ready to hear it, but I can't pretend it isn't true. I love you." Her throat tightened, her vision blurring. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "I love you too." Her voice trembled, but the words rang clear. For a moment, they only looked at each other. Then Adrian leaned in, pausing just long enough for her to meet him halfway. Their kiss was soft and sure, a kiss that felt like coming home. When they pulled back, Juliet smiled through tears. "You know, the world still scares me, but you make it worth walking back into." Outside, the sea rolled in and out, steady as the life she was learning to claim again. Thanks so much for those of you who stayed to the end. As I mentioned in the description, this story was partly inspired by one of my good friends who is a poet who struggles with a bit of agoraphobia. And while she's nowhere near Juliet's level of fearful of the outside world, it does affect how we hang out with one another and how we strategize if we do choose to go out. Like picking spots that we know won't have a ton of people, We're picking times of day to go out where we know it won't be as crowded if we're going to check out a new place. So the story really was written from a perspective of a lot of tender care for people who experience this. And myself, as someone who experiences a lot of anxiety in life and has talked to counselors about it, I imagined that would be something that Juliet would also be going through quite a bit. So that's a bit of the story on how Juliet came to be. And her therapist, Dr. Lewis, actually shares some tips and techniques that I learned in my own journey with anxiety, things that I heard from, the therapist that I was talking to and found helpful. But they're definitely not, the end-all be-all tips or tricks. And I hope I made that clear. At one point, I think Dr. Lewis even says to Juliet, when he invites her to reframe kind of the sensations she's feeling in her body after she sent out the poetry application as excitement rather than dread. I wanted to really intentionally put a line in there, which did make it into his dialogue, that, that type of reframing probably wouldn't work for her other, anxieties. It was specific to that situation because she was already coming to the table acknowledging that, hey, this application is kind of a positive thing, but I'm out of sync with myself. I imagine there was a whole lot more therapy and coaching and support that went into Juliet that we just don't see in the story. But in my mind, she's been going through that. So hopefully it didn't seem too fast, kind of her progression to venturing outside again. I hoped it was clear that there was, over a year of work that she was doing to even get her to the point where she was going to the beach in the mornings in chapter 1. So she'd done a lot of work before we even met her in that first sentence of the story. I also waffled on whether to include this story here on the Cozy Love Stories channel. I think there's a lot of elements to this that feel cozy, but I also want to tell stories that are about real people. And real people are complicated and flawed and have real struggles. So I tried to balance that fun, cozy relationship building between Juliet and Adrian with the letters with some of the harder things that were going on in the background of the story. I think we got to a good point of balance, but I'd love to hear from y'all. Do you still consider this story in the umbrella of a kind of a cozy love story, or have we veered too far off the mark? Please let me know in the comments what you think. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love it if you could give this video a like, and if you'd like to listen to more cozy romances, please consider subscribing. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a great day. Stay cozy, friends.